And bear with my accent. I realize that we're used to hearing all sorts of accents these days because we are kind of a global astronomy outreach community now, which is fantastic. So again, I'm part of the Reach Out Touch Space panel on Mondays, but I'm also part of several other groups, including the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada's Montreal Centre here in Montreal, Canada, Quebec. I'm part of the National Education Public Outreach Committee here. I'm also one of the Astronomical League club members at the University of Lowbrows in Michigan, just because I wanted to be part of the Astronomical League. And on every Tuesday night, now I say night, but it's night in North America, so it's early morning for you Wednesday, just starts around midnight Universal Time. I'm on the Explore Alliance Global Star Parties, and that's hosted by Explore Scientific and the Astronomical League. So those are amazing. Starting tonight at 7 o'clock, we're going to go for about 4 hours on the topic of transformation in astronomy. And the topics and the presentations go in all sorts of different directions. So please do come to any of our outreach. We have a blast. We enjoy having audience from all over the world. And our website is there for RASC Montreal. One thing you'll notice is our public events have still been by Zoom up till now, but we're hoping to be back in person. But the hope is when we have presenters like we will in the fall again, is to be co-modal so that we also share them with our YouTube community as well as our Zoom community. Now, I realize that not everybody knows where Montreal is, so I always start off with this wonderful map of North America focused in on the US and the populated parts of Canada. And since we're astronomers, I figure we start with a light pollution map. And you can see that the eastern seaboard there in North America is ridiculously light polluted. And that light sink up there, that's Montreal. And we are actually the third worst in terms of artificial light pollution in the entire world per capita over the span of the year. And the reason for that is a couple of fold. First off, this is a wonderful picture taken by astronaut David Saint-Jacques from the ISS of our city at night, so you can see just how much light there is. As well, in the wintertime, and honestly, it's for about 5 months of the year, we are surrounded by snow and ice, which means that the reflectivity enhances all of this artificial light to just make this a complete light dome that makes it unbearable to try to do astronomy in a large part of the year. So what do? How do we get to see the skies that the ancients saw, that the indigenous people saw? Well, if you don't have time to get all the way out to dark skies, you find the darkest area you can near your city. And if you look at the western tip of the island over there, that's called the Morgan Arboretum. It's a protected area run by McGill University. And that's where we have our observatory. It's a 14-inch telescope. It's a Cassegrain-Schmidt setup on a really wonderful Meade fork mount and a Paramount fork mount. Sorry, we just changed it right before COVID hit. And it allows us to do some outreach, but also to do a little bit of science even in the city. And then just south of there is where my campus is, John Abbott College. And so when I first started teaching astronomy about 7 years ago now, one of the first things that I did was try to bring together this partnership between the students and the approach that I have to astronomy at the college with the local amateur astronomers. And so I reached out to the Royal Astronomical Society and the Montreal Centre I joined. And it turned out that we actually already had an existing relationship that had just kind of petered out because there was really no reciprocality there. It was just a small collection of books that we held for the Astronomical Society to come and access. So over the span of a few years, we reached the point that you see there during the 2017 partial solar eclipse, where we had 5,000 people over the span of the day come out to our college to share in this wonderful event where we could see 63% of a total eclipse. So we couldn't see everything, and it would have been nice to go and see totality because I never have. But April 8th, 2024, we have another total eclipse coming right through our campus, and this time around it is totality. So the hope is that weather in April will allow us to have a true totality experience. Now, over the span of several years, we've grown this relationship where the students help to run our public events. They come out to our observing nights and help us to set up equipment. They share with us the wonder of astronomy through both outreach as well as these members observing activities and citizen science that we do together. And that leads to this sort of a enhanced relationship where we have students seeing the skies for the first time, researchers doing actual astronomy and astrophysics, And then hobbyists and astrophotographers who get to share a little bit of why they love the night sky with a captive and interested audience, as well as working together to deliver public events that go completely across the stream. It's a fantastic environment. And during COVID times, it's really kind of kept us going, this idea that they have this bank of mentors and experienced amateur astronomers to go to when they themselves don't get to spend too much time under the night skies. They can still hear the stories, see the pictures, and live kind of vicariously through the amateur astronomers. But the other thing that comes from this is that when there's something new going on in the way in which we approach astronomy, science, or culture, it comes from both sides. Sometimes the students lead into the astronomers, sometimes the astronomers lead into the students. And because we have our public events on campus during non-COVID times, we began doing these Indigenous acknowledgements of the fact that the land that we're on in North America, and specifically here in Montreal, is land that wasn't ceded. It was actually taken from the Indigenous peoples. And so it's a recognition as part of a reconciliation and arbitration type of process where we recognize that they've taken care of the land. So when I started having astronomy events where we wanted to start off with an acknowledgement of some sort, I took it to a different point where I started acknowledging not just the land, but also the skies, because the skies are not just ours. The skies have been seen for generation upon generation, and our understanding of the sky has grown over time. But one of the things we wanted to appreciate was the connection that the Indigenous peoples have to nature. So I try to always start off either with the constellation that I want to talk about or something that's happening in the night sky, or just what the moon is for that month, because our public events are typically held right near the full moon. So Roger Hyman, one of our Astro Radio friends and here in the audience, always posts his wonderful pictures of the moon and has given me permission to use them in some of my presentations and slides. And so this is the moon from last night. So this is a 99% waning gibbous right after the full moon. And at this point in the lunar calendar, we are at what is called the budding moon by the Ojibwe of the Great Lakes. And it's called the budding moon because the medicinal plants of the Great Lakes region are just starting to bud and provide the healing medicines that we need after a long winter. The Cree of North America and the Micmac of the May moon, they call this a little bit more of the frog croaking moon, because both the Cree as well as the Micmac are close to water. And close to water, you hear the amphibians croaking during this time of year in their mating call. The Cherokee and a lot of the settlers from Europe tend to refer this more as the planting moon or the flowering moon or even the milk moon, because it signifies this time in spring where you really can start to look towards your planting for your harvest later in the summer. And also, the fact that the flowers like the tulips are blooming right now is something that kind of changes the way in which the sky is, or the way in which the landscape looks. So when we start to acknowledge these connections to nature, one of the things we recognize is that the Indigenous peoples have seen these lands, they've seen these stories for generations upon generations. And so there's a lot of observation as well as actually some science in their stories and in their understanding. And I became aware a couple of years ago of this wonderful project called the Miseen Moons project that comes from our eastern coast here in Canada, the Halifax Centre. And the way this started out was one of the First Nations individuals, Kathy LeBlanc from Acadia First Nation. She was working at Kajimikajik National Park, which is a dark sky preserve from the RASC and is also a First Nations settlement site. And so she gives talks. She talks a little bit about the Indigenous culture and a little bit about the way in which they use the land. And she was asked to give a nighttime talk about the stars. And she said, I can tell you the stories. I can talk about Moen and the 700 birds and the idea of how that bear moves through the sky throughout the year. And those birds chase it when it chases away their natural prey until they can get it to subside back into the caves. But by then it's wintertime. And so there's not much prey left for them to have. And come spring, the birds are out there, they're hunting it, but the bear comes out of his out of his cave hungry, and they have to chase it away again before it scares away all of the smaller prey. So I can tell you these stories, I can share them, but I don't know the astronomy. I can't explain to you what you're looking at, what those stars are, how far away they are, any of that. So she reached out to our local RASC center, and Dave Chapman, one of our incredible outreach people, he offered to go and join her. And what they quickly realized was there's an incredible benefit to sharing the Indigenous stories with the astronomy hand in hand. So one of the first projects that they put their mind to was taking those moons throughout the year and actually recognizing what those moons stand for. So they had the elders of the Mi'kmaq talk about the stories of the moons, give recitations of how to pronounce the moons because the actual words carry so much power and so much meaning, and directly connected to what's happening in nature. So one example I already gave you is the frog croaking, but one of the examples that I absolutely love is the December moon right around the winter solstice is called the chief moon. But in the southern hemisphere, in the Australian Aboriginals, for example, their spirit moon, which is the equivalent of the chief moon, happens close to our summer solstice, their winter solstice. So why is it that the moons near the winter solstice are called the chief moon or the spirit moon? Well, there's two reasons. One is because night lasts longer, so the moon is with us for a longer time, visible for that full moon to brightly show our landscape, especially in the wintertime when, it's cold and it's desolate. And so having the moon with you gives almost like this lending of guidance or of watching over you. But the other reason is orbital, because we know that our summer solstice is when we're tilted towards the sun, so the sun is the absolute highest in our sky. During the winter solstice, we're tilted away from the sun in the northern hemisphere, so the sun reaches the lowest altitudes in the sky. But that means that our night sky would be seeing the higher altitudes, and since the moon is a very close orbit to ours, only 5 degrees away, it means that the moon reaches its highest altitudes during the winter solstice. So not only is it up the longest, it's also up the highest. So these types of recognitions that in the actual legends of these moons and their names is captured not just a connection to nature, but also a connection to astronomy, is part of what came out of this Mi'kmaq Moons project. Another part that comes out is that there's a natural way for the Mi'kmaq to approach a lunar solar calendar, because they recognize that there's not exactly 12 full moons in a year. So they don't have a complicated calendar like the Chinese do or the Persians do, where they try to keep track of which lunar month you're in and what it signifies in nature. What they do is when the full moon is happening, if you look in nature and the behavior that you see doesn't match the next moon, you repeat a moon. And that happens every 3 years. So every 3 years, one moon gets repeated. And where that happens very much is a fluid border, a fluid line. So as I started studying a little bit more about the Mi'kmaq Moons project, I realized that there's so many other legends and so many other stories where the observations and the science come naturally into what you're looking at. And one of my favorite is from the Ojibwe, who are called the Anishinaabe or the Star People. Now, I talked to you about the Ojibwe before. They're from the Great Lakes area. And their entire stories, all of their legends, all their oral traditions handed down seem to revolve around the night sky. In fact, their drum arbor, their drum dance, and the dance that they do while they're performing that drum beat is all based on what's called the revolving sky, kajib kajig. So their story of what we would refer to in North America as the Big Dipper, or in Europe is referred to as the plow, or as Odin's wing, they refer to it as the fisher. And the fisher is an animal that is a year-round animal, but in the wintertime, it tends to get very, very hungry, very, very thin. And so the story is that the fisher brought together all the other winter animals that were also hungry, also starved, and said, "Where is summer? Why is summer not here?" Now, in the legends of the Anishinaabe, we live on what's called Turtle Island, and there is a spiritual realm across almost, you could consider it like a wormhole, across a gap, a hole in the sky. And from there, the peoples come to the Turtle Island to inhabit Turtle Island, and the animals have their own function here, but they also have their function over there in that spiritual realm. And so when Oshik, the fisher, brought all these animals together, they said, well, the summer animals are keeping summer with them. They've got it pinned up on a cabin over in the spiritual realm, and they're not giving it back to us because they're happy to have summer with them. So Fisher decides that he's going to sacrifice himself, and he tells the other winter animals, because they're so much smaller than he is, that if you can distract the summer animals, I will chase in, I will free summer, and I will bring it back. So they start a big distraction, a lot of noise. They get the attention of the summer animals, and Fisher goes running in, and he grabs the bag of summer off of the cabin wall. But as soon as he does, the summer animals, the guardians, they see him and they chase after him. Now, Fisher is hungry and tired and worn out from the winter. The summer animals, I mean, they've had summer all along, so they're full of life and full of energy. So they quickly catch up to Fisher, and they shoot Fisher, and they kill Fisher. And that's, again, describing the movement of these stars and why in the middle of winter, right when you would want summer to come back, Fisher appears on his back at sunset. Now, this is the story, and the creator sees what Fisher's sacrifice has done, and it spills summer back towards Turtle Island. So Turtle Island slowly warms up, and summer finally comes back. So the creator rejuvenates Fisher, brings Fisher back to life, reincarnates him, and allows him to go through the cycle again and again, year after year, in honor of this sacrifice. Now, that story gives us a couple of things. It tells us about the movement of the Big Dipper at sunset throughout the year. It tells us a little bit about why it is that the stars sometimes start low, sometimes start high. The actual shape of the constellation turns onto its back. So there's a few aspects there. But what's really interesting is when you start to look at the bark paintings and the actual drawings of Fisher and of this legend. Because when you do, you see that in all of them, the arrow that kills Fisher strikes right at the tail. And not just right at the tail, but right at Alcor and Mizar, the visible double star arrangement in the Big Dipper. And when you ask the Ojibwe elders, why is it that the arrow hits at the tail? They're like, well, because the Fisher was running away, so when you shoot the arrow, you're going to hit the back end of the Fisher. And we know it hit that part. We know it hit the tail because if you look, you can see that that star has been split in two. So that astronomical observation is tied directly into the story of the Fisher of Oshik and how he brought summer back to Turtle Island for the other animals and the peoples of Turtle Island to survive. So when we talk about two-eyed seeing, this is a term to recognize that the strengths of indigenous culture and the strengths of modern scientific knowledge don't have to be apart. You can use one eye for each, and it benefits us to use that to see the night sky and understand better the way in which these legends, coming down from generation to generation, help to understand not just what the night sky was doing, but how it matches what you see in nature, and keep track of astronomical observations that were made by the ancients and indigenous peoples. So the Ojibwe have their own set of constellations, their own set of legends with these pareidolia images that capture what they see in the night sky. And one of my favorite, which I can talk about only from this perspective right now, is Wintermaker, what we would call Orion. Now, why can't I talk about Orion to other degrees? Let me mention that in a moment, but let me just tell you that the story of Wintermaker, as well as the story of all these other constellations, typically was passed down orally, from generation to generation. And so if you're passing down oral stories, you want to combine in as many lessons as you can. So there's not just the connection to nature, there's also the practical guides to care for nature, and the moral and ethical teachings that try to give you an idea of how the peoples as a whole can survive. So in some cultures, this arrangement of stars that we call Orion from the Greek tradition, these were referred to as a warrior that would protect the peoples as winter came. In some traditions, it was more of a planter, because in the South America or in the southern hemisphere, typically Orion came not at the start of winter, but at the start of spring. So he would bring planting and he would bring plentifulness. Often, the actual names, like Jopin for the northern peoples of Australia, signifies a specific event that teaches a moral for how that village can survive. So Jopin talks about why you don't eat sawfish. And in the Swana peoples, they talk about warthogs. Now, all of these stories, they tie into when you see these constellations. And so since right now Orion sets when the sun has set. We can't see it at night. We can't see it early in the morning. We can't talk about a lot of the Orion stories. But Wintermaker, for the Ojibwe, is a guidepost constellation. It's one of the ones that you keep an eye out for because it signifies what is happening to nature around you. So you teach kids from an early age to keep an eye out for Wintermaker. So I like talking about Wintermaker because I keep an eye out for Orion, and I tell this story every time, and my wife always laughs, but it's so true. When I see in the evening, when sun has set and it's gotten dark to astronomical twilight, I've got lots of lights around, so I can't still see very much, but I'll still pop out, see the moon, maybe see some planets, maybe even just pop out and just take a walk after dinner. But when I pop out, if Orion is coming above my neighbor across the street, if I see the belt, if I see the Pleiades, and I see Aldebaran, and I see Wintermaker reaching out, I know I have to empty one side of the garage and move my wife's car in because snow can come at any time. And when snow comes early in the morning, it's better to not have to clear off the car to get the kids to the bus on time. And so that's been my guidepost all along since I moved out here to the West Island of Montreal. And the Ojibwe used it as a guidepost in the same way, but for them it was in order to make sure that they were prepared for what could be a very rough winter. Now, the other stories of Orion I can't talk about, but part of that comes from this learning that I managed to do over these last couple of years, because at COVID times, NASA put together these beautiful Twoeyed Seeing workshops, and they brought in cultures and stories from across the globe. And one of the wonderful things that came of this was NASA created a set of materials for teaching Twoeyed Seeing in elementary and early secondary classrooms. Now, when I reached out to ask about those, one of the things I was told is when we give you any of these educational activities, they come with a caveat. And this is one of the best examples. It's from the Diné culture, which comes from the Navajo Indians, and they went right out to say that some of these stories cannot be told at certain times of the year because you have to have an observation of something associated to the story before you can start to tell the story. So the story of the stars, Squabahane, that has to be told with the respect to the authenticity, the authentic voice of these stories. So whenever possible, you get an elder to tell those stories. When you can't, like in a classroom, they will provide you videos, they will provide you audio of these stories, but you cannot share them at the wrong time. And that's part of the agreement you go into because you want their stories to be respected for the way in which they are sharing them. So what can you talk about? Well, one of the things that you can always talk about is the circumpolar constellations here in the Northern Hemisphere. So when we go out with wonderful outreach nights, one of the first things that I do with students and with the general public is I teach them how to find Polaris, the North Star. And we use the pointer stars from the Big Dipper, Dubhe and Merak, I call them the Pointer Sisters, and we use them to point right at Polaris and to show where the North Star is. And then we talk about the fact that all the stars revolve around the North Star almost, because the Earth is rotating. And so you can see that rotation by watching the opposite motion of these stars. And then you can even have them figure out the altitude of Polaris to figure out their latitude. And it's just a fantastic thing to show them. And then if you have enough time through the night, you can take, some nice pictures, patch them together into a nice star trail and show them where the Big Dipper and Little Dipper stars are within that star trail. And they get a feel for this motion of the night sky, right? That revolving sky that we talked about with the Anishinaabe. But one of the wonderful things about this is you also can then use the Big Dipper as your signpost to star hop. And when you start looking at the stories of the elders in some of these nations, what they do is they use their stories to take different constellations and describe how they're associated with other constellations. And we see that in the Greek myths, right? In the Greek myths, we see Orion matched with Taurus, matched with Gemini, matched with Sirius, because they're all moving together in the night sky. So you move from one to another as you go through the stories. So that idea of star hopping is something that the indigenous peoples and the ancients did through their oral traditions. And so when we talk about star hopping, we talk about it with our telescope, right? With our Dobsonian and moving it from point to point. They did it verbally. simply by talking through how you would go from one signpost to another. And then you start talking about these wonderful northern circumpolar constellations, and you start looking at the stories, and you realize how much similarity and difference there is from culture to culture. So one of the first similarities that you see is that a lot of cultures see Ursa Minor and Ursa Major as bears. The Greeks saw it as bears, a lot of the North Americans saw it as bears, the Romans saw it as bears. Why? Why bears? And it has to do with the fact that that shape through the night and through the seasons at sunset is moving in a way where it goes up on its hind legs. And there's very few animals that we know of that can stably go up on hind legs except the bears. So we can recognize why a lot of cultures see the plow as bears, as the Big Dipper and Little Dipper being part of the big bear and the little bear. But then you can start to see subtleties when you start to look at specific cultures. So for example, if you start to look at the Greek culture, in the Greek culture, in the Greek culture, when you're talking about the big bear and the little bear, Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, you're actually talking about Callisto and Arcas. Callisto was one of Zeus's wonderful paramours. She caught the eye of Zeus. She's absolutely beautiful. And so he had an excursion with her, to put it mildly, and gave birth to Arcas. And Arcas became this incredible hunter because, of course, he was part god. Now, Zeus's wife Hera was incredibly jealous. And so she wanted nothing more than to bring harm to Callisto and to bring harm to Arcas. But now how could she do that? How could she bring harm to them in such a way where she would be able to potentially get both of them killed, or at least, cause them great mortal harm? And so Zeus was on his toes all the time to make sure that Hera never found out that he was with Callisto when he was with Callisto, but he knew that Hera would turn insanely jealous if she ever found out about Arcas. So one day he's on a mountaintop and he's having a nice picnic with Callisto, and picnic is a euphemism for whatever else they might have been doing, and he hears Hera coming. So he quickly turns Callisto into a bear so Hera doesn't find out that there's a woman there with him. So Hera comes, she sees Zeus, they go for a walk, and he leaves Callisto the bear behind. And he thinks he'll come back and he'll free her later, and, he'll appease her and she'll be happy again. Classic abusive relationship there. Well, what happens? But Arcas is hunting in those mountains, and he sees this bear, and he shoots the bear, and he wounds the bear, and the bear turns back into his mom. So he gives out a cry of anguish. And Zeus realizes what has happened, so he quickly turns both of them back into bears and pushes them up to the sky so that they are no longer going to die, but also Hera doesn't realize what's happened. So now you have these two different constellations, asterisms of stars in the night sky, that are there because of Zeus's behavior and his fear of Hera's jealousy. The Romans have a different side to this story. For the Romans, Juno, Jupiter's wife, finds out about the relationship. And so in utter jealousy, she turns Callisto into a bear and on purpose puts Callisto where she knows that Arcas is hunting so that she can see Arcas kill his mom as retribution for this horrible act that Callisto has done, which is catch the eye of Jupiter. So Juno waits for her wonderful vengeance to come through. Arcas shoots Callisto. Callisto starts to turn back into his mom, and Jupiter arrives on the scene. So Jupiter turns them both into bears, grabs them both by the tail, and sends them flying up into the sky. And that's why, in the Roman myth, both of those tails are elongated. Now, this took me a while to figure out that that's actually part of it, is that he swings them by their tails to get them high enough so that Juno can't exact any revenge, because now they're really high up in the sky. So what does Juno do? She goes out to Neptune and says, Neptune, do you see those two sets of stars? Do you see those two bears up in the sky? They've really angered me, and they're filthy from their betrayal of everything we stand for. So I want you to make sure that they never get a chance to bathe. I don't want them to ever set foot in the ocean. They have to wear their filth for all eternity. And so Neptune, of course, listens to his sister and says, absolutely. And that's why those two bears never get to take a dip in the water, despite the fact that they're always up there in the sky, moving around and around and around and around. So this actually parallels a little bit of the culture, where in the culture, the Roman culture, the women had a lot of power. They could take actions for themselves. In the Greek culture, the women were a little bit more subservient. They could express their anger and they could make life hell for their husbands, but they didn't have an active role in society. And you see that in the way in which these stories come about. Now, in Scandinavia, they talk about this more in terms of Odin's wain, or you talk about it as Arthur's wain, or the gentleman's wain and the lady's wain, where you talk about a funeral procession. And that funeral procession, again, has to do with the fact that in the fall, in the winter, when you see that cart being moved up into the sky at sunset, you can see the bodies from the past year having been taken towards Valhalla, but they're not heroes, right? So they're not going with the Valkyries, but instead it's Odin's job to take them up so that they can then be servants in the afterlife for the peoples of Scandinavia, for the heroes. So they'll serve in Valhalla rather than be festive in Valhalla. But in the wintertime, as winter becomes darker and deeper and longer and death starts to mount, that wagon has to come back down to take the next set of bodies back up the next time around. Now, it turns out that even in a lot of other cultures, like the Arab cultures, they see this as a funeral procession as well. They see it as a coffin with 3 mourners following around after it. So it's not always just the vision of what you see as matching something in nature. Sometimes it's matching natural processes. And so the observations of stars and movements of stars is something that was inherent in all ancient knowledge, but also in a lot of the indigenous stories, as we've seen over the last little bit. But it's not just the movement of stars, there's also these wanderers that move through. And the capture of what the wanderers are doing requires stories that can capture the behavior that you're seeing. So the wanderers didn't move with the revolving sky, they moved slightly differently. The Greeks referred to them as wanderers. The ancients referred to them, especially a lot of the indigenous, as spirits, because those spirits would move around in different ways. And so one of those spirits is Mars. And Mars is one where it's very nice and visible to the naked eye when it comes close enough. And so if you watch it over the span of several months, you'll see it exhibit retrograde motion, where it moves back in its orbit relative to what we see. And, you know, the Greeks would try their best to try to explain this with epicycles and all of this. But for the indigenous peoples, they actually referred to it as Muswa Akap, which is the moose spirit. This is what a moose looks like, a common animal here in the plains in Canada. And so what the Cree would talk about is this idea that when a moose is herding and it's grazing and it's walking, if something startles it, because it's such a massive animal and it has so much inertia, it doesn't just stop when it's startled. It doesn't start moving very quickly when it's startled. It keeps going at the same pace it's going at, but it goes in a full circle. And if it sees what startled it, it'll make a decision on what to do. But if it doesn't, then it just continues on its way. So whenever Mars would undergo retrograde motion, it was inhabited by the moose spirit, by Muswa Akak. And so it would make this retrograde motion, Kitampapano. And that would be this circling to see what had startled it. And if it doesn't see what startled it, it just keeps going. The brightest of the planets for us to view is, of course, Venus. And Venus, we know, is both a morning star and an evening star, and even the Babylonians had seen this. And they captured it, and they realized that it seemed to be the same thing that appeared sometimes in the morning and sometimes in the evening, because when it was in the morning, it was never visible that same night, and vice versa. So the Babylonians knew that this seemed to be the same thing moving from one side of the sky to another. In northern Australia, they referred to this as the morning star, and they thought that this star was there to light the way for the fishermen to go out in the mornings and to come back in the evenings, because there's so many reefs and so many rocky areas that they needed light to be able to guide their way. And so rather than wait until sunrise, which is too late to get out there to do the early fishing, they would wait until Venus could light their way. Now, the story has to do with that, but then the question comes in, why does Venus always stay close to the horizon? And the way they talked about it is that this morning star was afraid of drowning, and so she was hesitant. And sometimes she wouldn't come out with the boaters in the morning, and sometimes she wouldn't be there when they would come back in the evening. And so in order to convince her that it's okay for her to come out, two of the elder women tied a string around her so that she would never drown and they'd always pull her back in. But as a result, she never goes too high into the sky. So these observations of the planets, just like the observations of the stars, have in them a bit of astronomy tied into the legends and the stories that they share. But then you can have true science matched in without an understanding of what that science might mean. And one of my favorite examples comes from Torres Strait, again, right around Australia. And this is a Twinkling Stars song. And the Twinkling Stars song basically says, if it's a clear, calm night, but the stars above are twinkling, what does this mean? It means there's a big wind coming, and otherwise, why would the stars be twinkling? And the concept that they're talking about is, of course, scintillation. It's the idea that the Earth's upper atmosphere is moving around, and so the starlight is bouncing around before it gets to our eyes. Now, if it's absolutely clear all around you, there's no clouds, there's no humidity, but up above there's scintillation, that means that you have high altitude trade winds. And high altitude trade winds throughout that region of the Pacific indicate the monsoon season coming. And the monsoon season is a requirement because without the monsoon season, they are stuck only getting some food from the ocean and from the seas and from the straits. But when you actually have the monsoon season pass through, now the land turns green and they can plant the plants that will sustain them for the rest of the year. Until then, all you can have underground growing are yams. And if you leave the yams in the ground when the monsoons come, the yams become flooded and become rancid, and they become fetid very quickly. So they would go bad, and you wouldn't have the yams, which is the essential starch for their sustenance through the winter months. And so the song tells them what to keep an eye out for to prepare for the monsoon season so that they can be ready for the changes that are coming to the land around them. That's impressive because without even understanding what was causing the twinkling, they matched the twinkling to what they see coming after. And in other times of the year, when we can talk about the Pleiades, we can even talk about how the Andes mountain, there's people there that used observations of the Pleiades to predict the El Nino effect 400 years ago. So these types of observations of the atmospheric changes to the lights that you see coming from stars is something that was really captured in the stories from these different First Nations. But that's not the only atmospheric effects that you can see. When you have a halo of those 22-degree bows, which are these are beautiful ones captured by Mary McIntyre, who a lot of you know, I know. But also when you get the sun dogs and the moon dogs at those 22-degree distances where the light actually condenses into mock suns and mock moons. I mean, those are captured in story. Aristotle talked about mock suns rising and following the sun always to the side. In the War of the Roses, Edward IV convinced troops that the 3 sons of the Duke of York were with them. And that's why the sun had sprouted 2 more mock suns with them. And that convinced them to take charge that day and enter into battle. There's observation there, but there's no real scientific knowledge tied in there. But then you look at something like the Winter of 3 Suns in Newfoundland, when Newfoundland was still a British colony back in 1843. There were 15 straight days of observations of sundogs. And over those 15 days, it was icy, it was cold, and it became incredibly treacherous to walk or try to move because that biting ice just created an absolutely horrible situation for anybody trying to move around, and all structures, everything got coated with ice. And so that's now written into the actual almanacs from Newfoundland from the 1800s and was used as observations. If you see sundogs, be ready for ice. And even up till the mid-1900s, they were still using that to decide when it was necessary for them to salt on slopes and when it would be okay. If you didn't see sundogs or the halo, you're okay not salting because even if it's icy, it's not going to be too bad. Now, not all peoples were able to hand down oral traditions. In a lot of cases, it was archaeoastronomy. It was archaeoastronomical sites that were built and left behind. And places like Stonehenge were ones where we try to decipher exactly what those places are. Other than burial grounds, they have, it appears from the placement of the rocks and the carvings, specific associations with the positions of the sun and other stars throughout the year. And so we have, midsummer and midwinter festivals, and we know at the moment, we believe that Stonehenge has more of an association with midwinter than it does with midsummer, despite the actual prevalence of the festivals. But one of the things I love is when we actually make a mistake in our observations simply by symmetry or by some sort of a similarity with what we're seeing. And so a few years back in Lake Michigan here in North America, they found a group of underwater stones. Those underwater stones seem to have a very peculiar placement, and they found an arc of those stones. And so the journalists went off. Another Stonehenge, North American Stonehenge found. Is this Stonehenge proof of early inhabitants other than the indigenous people? Just every single direction you could go. And then they started using sonar to try to figure out where these other rocks might be, because all the rocks had the same consistency, which was different than the rest of the ground and the base of Lake Michigan. And they realized that that arc was a small part of a very large arrangement of stones. And that large arrangement of stones didn't seem to have any connection to the night sky, any connection to the position of the sun. So they tried to figure out what this was. And since there's still so many First Nations near the Great Lakes, they went from First Nation to First Nation to ask about stories of archaeoastronomical sites. So they asked, do you have stories of stone creations that tell the positions of the stars? And they asked these very, very specific questions. And then they changed the question and said, do you have stories of arrangements of stones used by your peoples? That was it. And all of a sudden, a story came out from the Cree that the Cree of the Great Plains used to set up these hunting grounds where they would herd caribou up through one side, and their hunters would be along the other side in these windows between the rocks to pick out the weakest of the herd. And then at the end, the rocks would curl to push them towards a new grazing location so that those same herds would be protected from the winter, and the next year could sustain the village as well. And that's what this was. This was a hunting ground. This had nothing to do with astronomy, and everything to do with the sustenance of the group, of the tribe, of the village, but nothing to do with astronomy itself. And then you have instances like the Dowth Passage Tomb, where, unlike the Knowth and the Newgrange, for Dowth, when they actually tried to go in, they detonated it and they destroyed the whole passage tomb. And so we can't see the precise arrangements of a lot of the areas within the passage tomb. But what we can see is that entry stone, and that entry stone does seem to have observations that have to do with what appear to be eclipses. And we have one of our local members here in Montreal, Robin Edgar, who's done a lot of research on the passage tombs. And I know a lot in our audience know more about the passage tombs than I do, but at midwinter and midsummer in a lot of these passage tombs, specific chambers are lit up because of the specific location of sunlight at local noon passing down through. And that's the part that I want to carry with us to a discussion of a couple of other archaeoastronomical complexes. And these ones specifically are ones that are, unfortunately, no people's left to tell us what the truth might be. Chanquillo is one of them in Peru, and my son actually just talked about wanting to go to Peru, hopefully in this summer or next summer, because he wants to see this for himself. Because in Chanquillo, there are these wonderful solar observatories where there are notations on the walls. There's a ton of different specific spots where the sun shines in specific ways. And a lot of archaeologists are still trying to decipher some parts of this to figure out exactly what they were doing with the solar calendar. But the one that I love showing my students is when observing from these here solar observatories towards a distant mountain range, there's this set of teeth that were carved into the top of one of these mountains. And if we follow these teeth throughout the span of the year, the sun rises between the teeth at very specific times, equally spaced throughout the year. And so from June solstice to December solstice, when the sun rises the furthest south to the furthest north, for them within their view in Peru, you can actually see the sun move from point to point in equal intervals. And the equinox happens at exactly the seventh, well, right after the sixth tooth from the left and the sixth tooth from the right, where you have exactly 12 hours daylight and 12 hours nighttime almost everywhere across the world. Well, give or take a slight bit. That sunrise observatory gives rise to this understanding of how they were able to use these teeth as a calendar to determine when things need to be planted, when things need to be harvested, when specific rituals were needed in order for them to ensure that they were appeasing the right gods to prepare for winter and to prepare for the hunting season. We can do this ourselves with solography using SolarCan, which is there from the UK, and the new SolarCan puck. I cannot wait to get it. There's a Kickstarter for it right now. I'm looking forward to having a few different reusable films so that I can hopefully get even more solography. But this was taken from the roof of my campus. And you can see from winter solstice with that lowest altitude in December 21st, 2020, all the way through to the highest one from June 21st, 2021, you have not just a difference in the altitude at local noon, but also where the sun rises. Where in the wintertime it rises the furthest south, and in the summertime it rises the furthest north, because that gives us the length of day that we see as we're tilted towards the sun from here in the northern hemisphere. Now, in the Mi'kmaq Park, right outside Kajukamajuk, they've now created a sky pillar to mimic this based on the legends of the Mi'kmaq talking about figuring out the time of year based on the shadows that the sun casts. So this sky pillar is facing directly north-south line so that the shadow falls exactly at local noon when the sun passes the meridian. And so in the wintertime, the shadow will be incredibly small, and in the summertime, the shadow will be incredibly large. And you can see behind Dave and Jen there that you have specific set rocks, kind of like those teeth that we saw in Chankio, that tell you how far you are from winter solstice to summer solstice as that shadow spreads along that direction. So this is a recent addition to the Mi'kmaq legends that they've added in to try to enrich a little bit more of how astronomy and the movement of the sun specifically matches what you see in the legends of the Mi'kmaq peoples. Now, Chaco Canyon in New Mexico is one where the more you dive into this place, the more you realize how much the Anasazi seem to understand the sky. So I'm going to tell you a few snippets of this, but first, to explain to you, Chaco Canyon is uninhabited and the Anasazi people were wiped out. In fact, Anasazi in the Navajo term and the Dakota Lakota language means enemy people. So either they were incredibly aggressive towards their neighbors and the neighbors came and attacked to wipe them out, or the neighbors saw them as enemies and wanted Chaco Canyon and so they wiped them out. We don't know which, but we know there's no Anasazi left to tell their story. So how we tell their story is based on what we can see inside of their wonderful complex here. And the first place I ever heard of them was from this observation that comes on a petroglyph in their canyon of the Crab Nebula. Now, there were two supernovas during the time that the Chacoan civilization was at its height, which was the 11th century. You had 1054 AD, which was, of course, the Crab Nebula. Then you have 1006 AD as well. But the specific location of the crescent moon and Venus with that nebula tells us that that was most likely an observation of the Crab Nebula. But if you look on the floor near this specific location, right down there on the ground, there's a colored painting. And that colored painting initially was thought to maybe be an eclipse. But there was no eclipse during that time that would have had that much of an asymmetry to the corona. So then they realized that that is most likely the observation of Halley's Comet, which passed through that region on 1066. So right around the same time, which is why it would have been in the same area of the canyon that it was depicted. And Halley's Comet, of course, you would have that core as well as that tail coming off of it. So we have these beautiful observations of astronomical events. But when you go further in, you realize that there was a solar calendar which almost defies understanding from that level in the 11th century. And this is what's called the sun dagger. And the sun dagger is this dagger of light that shines through the exact middle of this large spiral exactly at the summer solstice. So at the summer solstice, shortly past 11 a.m. local solar time, so right before solar noon, a small spot of sunlight appears at the top of this large spiral. It enhances into the dagger. The dagger gets cut off and moves down the spiral and then disappears. And that is a 20-minute process. But when this was first observed and they realized that this dagger appears exactly at the summer solstice, they started investigating what else this spiral showed throughout the year. And so what they were able to find is that during the spring equinox and fall equinox, that large dagger falls just off center of that large spiral. But a second dagger appears in a smaller snake spiral just off to the side because of the arrangement of the rocks above this spiral. So the equinoxes are both identical because, of course, at the equinox, you want to see identical behavior because that's what you see with the sun's motion on the equinox, right? 12 hours daylight, 12 hours nighttime, and the sun rises to the exact altitude that you would expect based on the tilt in your latitude. At winter solstice, you have two daggers coming down either side of the large spiral. And it's incredible to see that that summer solstice was repeated again and again and again and again. And then during one observation period, the rocks shifted and they realized that this whole assembly is actually incredibly fragile. And so these sun daggers no longer appear. They can't be seen. But the whole area is still being studied, and so that whole area is now a protected area both by the US, by New Mexico, as well as by the local indigenous peoples. They've all agreed that this is a protected area. But it actually goes a small step further, because remember we talked about the relationship between the moon and the sun? That when the sun is at its highest, the moon is at its lowest, and when the moon is at its highest, the sun is at its lowest during its peak moments? Well, we can actually see the moons create a moon dagger on these different rocks, and that was first noticed by one of the archaeologists who decided to camp out for the night because they wanted to see if there was a sunrise and sunset effect on these rocks, and they saw a full moon effect, a full moon dagger, and they were astonished. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because if you follow that full moon dagger, because the moon's orbit is a 5-degree tilt from ours, it actually doesn't align the moon, earth, sun all the time. And it's an 18-plus year period before the syzygy repeats. And over the span of those 18-plus years, the moon dagger moves around this large spiral until it repeats its position. So the large spiral is of that size to capture the full winter solstice, the full summer solstice, and the actual spiral nature appears to cut the 18-plus year syzygy period into predictable chunks. Now, how this was used by the Anasazi, we have no idea. But the fact that they were able to capture such intricate astronomical observations into these wonderful petroglyphs is just, it's inspiring. And there have been simulations and there have been reproductions to try to create this exact same setup. And so there are models of this setup available to take a look at and to see how this works. But we're still trying to understand the way in which this large spiral matches the moon behavior. We have not understood that completely yet. Now, when you look further in the canyon, then you all of a sudden see an actual picture that seems to be a solar eclipse. Now, why do I say that's a solar eclipse? Because when you look at that, that doesn't look like the solar eclipses that we saw on the Dowth entry stone. But that solar eclipse that would have happened around the time that the Chaco civilization was around, there was one that was inked out in, I believe this was the Aztec Empire. This was in the Andes Mountains, that they had this image that was a petroglyph found there of a solar eclipse. And you can see this weird spiral nature of the corona. And that spiral nature of the corona is something that actually does come out in model simulations when the sun is incredibly active. So when you go back over the 11-year solar cycle and you trace back through when a totality might have happened visible in New Mexico, guess what? It was during a solar maximum. So there is a possibility that this is an actual observation of a total solar eclipse. So one of the things we definitely need to talk about with the lunar eclipse that just happened 2 days ago is predicting and documenting eclipses in ancient astronomy. And that cycle of 18 plus years for syzygy is something that was first credited to Babylonian astronomers because the Saros cycle was something that they were able to denote, and they used lunar eclipses to predict solar eclipses because they would follow the same cycle. Now, lunar eclipses were regarded as evil omens, and I'll talk more about that in a few moments. But one of the really interesting things to keep in mind is if you could predict solar eclipses and you could predict lunar eclipses, you would hold sway over your peoples because most of the first tribes in all of the regions on Earth saw the sun and the moon as gods. And so in 2159 BC, Emperor Kang of China was incredibly angry at his two court astrologers, Ho and He, because they incorrectly predicted an eclipse. They got the timing wrong. And so because they could not spy the eclipse at the right moment, they were slain on the spot. They were beheaded. And that was what was inscribed on their tomb as kind of a word of warning for anybody who says that they can predict eclipses to make sure that you're right, because if you're wrong, there's hell to pay. Now, when we talk about these lunar and solar eclipses always appearing together, we see that in the Dresden Codex. We see that on the Doubt petroglyph, where whenever you see a depiction of a lunar eclipse, you have a solar eclipse right next to it, and vice versa. So there was an acknowledgement early on that when the sun was disappearing, the moon was disappearing as well, and typically visible from around the same area of the world. So what legends came about to talk to us about these? And last year I was able to share with you an annular solar eclipse legend that was shared from one of our Innu astrophysicists, Laurie Rousseau-Neptune, who works at the Canada-France-Hawaii Telescope. And she was gracious enough to actually record these legends of the solar eclipse and share them in both English, French, and the Innu culture, and the Innu language, sorry. Unfortunately, we don't have a solar eclipse happening at the moment, so I can't share this with you directly right now, but you can always watch it if you want. It is still recorded. But these solar eclipse legends, some of them can only be told right around the solar eclipse times, but others you're free to share. So I wanted to share with you a couple that are my favorites. First is from the Vikings, Hati and Skoll. Hati and Skoll were the sons of Fenrir, and those two wolves would chase after the moon and the sun through the sky. And the legend has it that if they ever catch the sun and the moon and they eat them and they keep them, that signals Armageddon. That signals the apocalypse, the end of the world. And so sometimes Skoll would catch up to the moon, and sometimes Hati would catch up to the sun, and they would swallow them, except that the moon was frigidly cold and the sun was incredibly hot, and so they couldn't keep them in their mouth, and they'd spit them back out. But they would not give up. They would persevere, and they would chase after them again, and they would swallow them again. But again, they just couldn't keep them, and they'd spit them out. And if they did this a couple of times, and they realized that they couldn't handle the cold, or they couldn't handle the heat, Hati and Skoll would actually swap jobs. And so if Skoll found that he couldn't handle the cold, he'd switch with Hati and go chasing after the sun instead. And this is captured in a really interesting way in the Viking epic poems, because the actual gender of Hati and Skoll keeps changing depending on whether they're chasing the moon or whether they're chasing the sun, which is incredibly subtle. But it also captures the reason why lunar eclipses, when one happens, another one will happen soon after, 6 months after. Another one may happen 6 months after that. And then there's a gap before you see a bunch more from that same point in the globe. So for us here in North America, we were able to see a lunar eclipse for part of last May, last November, this May, 2 days ago, and then this coming November. And then we're going to have a gap where we don't get to see the next few lunar eclipses. And so this legend of why they keep spitting it out and then swapping positions actually gives a little bit of a reasoning for why that sort of patterning happens. Hinduism, there's a beautiful story of the demon Rahu who's jealous when the Lord Vishnu decides to distribute the nectar of immortality to some of the gods. And the sun god Surya and the moon god Chandra, they are having their immortality, they take it, everything's good, and they realize that one of the guests isn't a god, it's the demon Rahu in disguise. So they tell Vishnu, they go and they end up telling Vishnu. Vishnu gets angry, goes after Rahu and beheads Rahu, but not before Rahu has quaffed a little bit of this immortality serum. So now, the whole snitches get stitches type of mentality. Well, Rahu kind of lived by that. So the sun and the moon were the snitches. So he got angry and he started chasing them through the sky. And every now and then he catches up to one of them and he swallows them. The problem is he's a beheaded immortal head. And so he swallows the sun or he swallows the moon, but they come straight back out the other side. And once they come straight back out the other side, he goes chasing after the next one. He swallows, comes out the other side, goes chasing after the next one. And that's why solar eclipses and lunar eclipses often cycle. The Egyptians, well, they would see the solar bark of Ra whenever an eclipse happened close to sunrise or close to sunset. And that's something that we saw beautifully last June when we actually had the annular solar eclipse happening just as the sun rose. And then for the lunar eclipse that we just saw, there's a couple of wonderful stories from that. One is from the Hupa Indians. And the Hupa Indians, when they see the moon turn red, they fear for the moon. They feel that the moon has been wounded. And why it's wounded? Well, the Incas used to think that a jaguar would swallow the moon, and so they would make lots of noise to try to get the jaguar to let the moon free. Well, something was definitely attacking the moon because bits of the moon were disappearing. And then all of a sudden the moon is red, and we need the moon because the moon provides the tides. So the Hupa of California would sing healing chants for the entire time that the moon was red and continue to sing those healing chants until the shadow left the moon completely and the moon was back to normal. In Mesopotamia, when they knew that a lunar eclipse was coming, when they saw that little shadow starting, they were afraid that it was an attack on their king. So they would take their king and they would put their king into hiding, and they would put a proxy king on the throne. And that proxy king would be trusted to make the decisions, but if there was an attack, their true king would be safe, and the proxy king would be the one to die. So there were these legends and tales of the eclipses that tried to capture what was seen in the night sky and translate it in a way for two reasons. One is to capture what you see happening over a long cycle and capture that into the story. But two is a little more subtle. The reason why these stories exist is not just to give you fanciful tales and to tell you what to look out for, but it's also to calm you, to realize that this isn't the first time this is happening. There's nothing to be worried about. This will come to pass. Whether you have to sing healing chants for the moon to come back to its full white and grayish glory, whether you have to wait until Ra settles down and the sun comes back in full, and Ra says, I've now given the people of Egypt one more chance to do the right ceremonies and the right sacrifices to keep on my good side. Whatever the reasoning, it gives you a little bit of solace that this has happened before, and we can weather this storm, this change in what was otherwise a very static and predictable sky. And so eclipses give us that moment of understanding that there really is a connection to nature, and that connection to nature is something that is universal. It's something that our ancestors dealt with, that we dealt with, and that our generations to come will deal with as well. So on that note, I'm going to leave you with this beautiful view of the galaxy rising and the galaxy moving through the night sky with a few meteors to be visible. And we're almost at galaxy season, but we're not quite there yet, where you can see the arm of the Milky Way. And I was actually very tempted to tell some of the stories of the Milky Way, and I'm going to leave you with a reasoning as to why I didn't. Let me just skip past these because I'm not going to tell them, but When you tell the stories of the Milky Way, for the First Nations here in Canada, especially that I've talked to, one of the things that they ask is that you not tell the stories of the Milky Way until you've seen the arm of the Milky Way yourself. Now, I live vicariously through others in astronomy, and so Adrian Bradley, one of my friends from the University of Lowbrows, posted this a couple of days ago of the summer triangle rising late into the night, and you can see the beautiful arm of the Milky Way. And Andrea Girones from Ottawa here, from one of our RASC centers, just posted this from Sunday night's eclipse, where you can just see the Milky Way coming out while the eclipse was happening. I stayed up Sunday. I was hoping to see something like this, but it was nothing but clouds and rain for us here in Montreal. And so I tried to convince myself that I could tell you all these stories of the Milky Way. And the reason I could tell you all these stories of the Milky Way was because my friends had seen the arm of the Milky Way. But deep inside, I know I haven't seen the arm of the Milky Way this year. And if I haven't seen it, I should not be sharing the stories. Because I'm not an authentic voice to begin with. I'm a learned voice. I'm a voice that spent time with these stories. So the stories I can tell you about are the ones that I've learned about, or the ones that I have permission to give. And if the permission for this one requires me seeing the arm of the Milky Way, I'm not there yet. But hopefully later on this summer, when I get to see the arm of the Milky Way myself, I'll be sharing these stories to other audiences, and you're always welcome to join me. So with a thank you for the Twoeyed Seeing and a reminder to use both eyes for the benefit of all, I have one more thing to share with you. And this is relatively recent. I shared this for the first time very recently. I was fortunate enough to get a copy of this painting from the Haida Gwaii of the aurora taking an eagle shape beside a full moon. And when I would post this in my class, my students would sometimes say, well, there's no way on a full moon you can see an aurora like that. I mean, the full moon is just too bright. Some of the local astronomers would say that as well. Well, from January 15th, 16th in Finland, here is a picture of the aurora with a full moon. And you can clearly see the bird wing shape. And so with that, I thank you. I encourage you to ask any questions you might have. And I hope you enjoyed this wonderful walk through Indigenous and ancient stories of Twoeyed Seeing. Wala liok, which means thank you in Mi'kmaq.
Thank you very much, Karim. Absolutely
My
excellent.
pleasure.
Yeah, good stuff. Right. We'll allow people to unmute themselves. If you've got a question for Karim, please unmute yourself and ask away.
Dave, could I just say, if you had to end on a lecture, what a lecture to end on. That was riveting from start to finish. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Lee.
Yeah, I really do agree with that, because every time, because the restrictions on telling the stories, the talk is always different. And this one was, I saw this about 2 weeks ago, and it's different from what it was then. You always learn something new. Just one question, Karim.
Sure.
As you said, we're talking about the polar star and the circumpolar stars, and there's, as you know, it's very important for the Egyptians and for the Chinese especially, because they're associated with pharaohs and emperors and the afterlife.
Yes.
Do you know if there's any same sort of stories for the? I know there's not really a South Polar Star, but anything similar about immortal stars or imperishable, or the imperishables as they're called?
Well, in Scandinavia, the reason why they call it Odin's Wain and talk about the fact that it's going around that point is that point was actually considered to be where the Valkyries would travel to go to Valhalla, right? So emptying the wain and emptying the trough into that point was specifically to go through that wormhole in that direction. The First Nations actually don't use the North Star as their portal into immortality or into the other realm, into the spiritual realm, and how they came to Turtle Island. They use where Grandmother Spider sits atop of the Milky Way. And so they actually use a few of the areas in the Milky Way. And this is where it's fascinating, because one of the areas that their legends associate to where the spirits would go when they're done on Turtle Island and they will never come back is right above Sagittarius And we know right above Sagittarius is Sagittarius A star. That's where the black hole is for the Milky Way. Now, how much of that is coincidence and how much of that is actually some sort of an appreciation that there's a conglomeration of dust and starlight that seems to come through that area, and that seems to be the center of whatever is happening, wherever that dust is accumulating is right around there, and therefore that must be the next destination after you finish on Turtle Island, after you've given all of your wisdom. That might be why they chose that specific spot. But they talk about it, and within their stories, they even refer to things that they can only be translated as wormholes. And so when they read astrophysics and when they talk to people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, they talk about the fact that they've had this in their stories for all times, and it's kind of dismissed. But it's dismissed because there's no direct correlation between those stories and the science that we're trying to understand now. But it's definitely more than a coincidence that that's the area that they chose.
Oh, thank you for that. That's fascinating.
You're welcome. It's also interesting to note that when you bring up the Chinese and their fascination with Polaris, their fascination is also with that Milky Way arm, and Altair and Vega being split up into two different sides of the universe, the cowherd and the Weaver Girl. That's one of those stories that you can't tell in full until closer to August. And this year, the 7th day of the 7th lunar month is August 4th. So on August 4th, the Magpie's Bridge will appear. And that Magpie's Bridge is the cross of Cygnus basically going through the Milky Way arm. And it's basically just when it's highest that you can see it the clearest. But they don't consider that to be where the Emperor would sit. When the Emperor sits in judgment on Altair and Vega, he sits lower in the sky, again, somewhere closer to Sagittarius.
Okay.
Just a few too many coincidences there to just brush it off completely.
Yeah, certainly is. Certainly is. Excellent. Thank you for that.
But don't the Australians talk about a Milky Way dust cloud looking like an emu?
Yes. And they also have, the riverboat moving through the Milky Way, or not the riverboat, but the canoe moving through the Milky Way. And so the Northern Australian stories are incredibly fascinating. And one of the things that I love is around the time of the International Year of Astronomy in 2009, they started this incredible reach to try to pull back the Indigenous stories and share them. And they've got one of the ones that I share in the wintertime is Songbird, which is the stories of the Pleiades and the Seven Sisters from across Australia. And it's connecting each bit of actual geological formation to the story as it is told at that moment in time. And that was an entire museum exhibit that they had down in Australia. And so one of the things they started to find is that when one group would see an emu, another group would see a fish, and another group would see, a flying fox. And they would be looking at the exact same stars, but seeing them differently depending on what they required as their most precious commodity for their village.
Yeah, because the Aborigines, of course, they've been sort of like very isolated for quite a long time before the Europeans came along. And of course, their cosmology, although it's very, very similar, it varies from different tribe to tribe.
Yep.
But their worldview is exactly the same throughout, but the stories all vary, which is very interesting, very intriguing. So, yes, it's very... and as Dave said, that they do see a lot of symbolism in the Milky Way, and yes. I think the Peruvians do as well. They've got stories of llamas being chased by wolves and things like that, and they can see them in the dust lanes of the Milky Way. So yeah, very fascinating.
They're so lucky to have the arm of the Milky Way all year round.
Yeah.
And so when I do incorporate in stories of the Milky Way into some of the aspects of the Twoeyed Seeing, it's almost always the Australian one, as well as the South African, as well as the Peruvian, because those are the three that I can talk about any time of the year. right? The Australian one with Pre-Perigi is the one that I mentioned in the
Mm.
Doncaster presentation and even the Liverpool presentation. But today I decided to replace that with the earlier discussion on the sky pillar as well as on the moon position through the year with the Chaco Canyon, the spiral. That one, the more I read about it, the more I want to actually go and spend time building one of these models and seeing if I can figure it out myself. You know, making an entire armorary and actually seeing all the motion and seeing what shadows I can create would be amazing.
Yeah, because the Chaco Canyon, once they discovered and they found out that it was associated with the solstice, of course, lots of people went down there and they started looking at all the pictoglyphs and everything else, and they found several more sun daggers and things like that. So there's plenty of them around, but they're all formed by natural slippage of rocks. They're not man-made.
This is actually the question, because it appears that they were natural, but then they created the petroglyphs to capture what they were seeing. But once they created one set of petroglyphs, the next one, which is the one that I was showing you, is far more intricate. The first one just had a circle with basically a bullseye in the middle. So sun dagger in summer solstice, it goes right in the middle. And in the winter solstice, it bridges it on both sides. That's all it was. And then there was a tiny pinpoint at the top where when it's in the equinox, it's somewhere in the region and at that tiny point. And now all of a sudden you have this beautiful double snake where one is incredibly intricate with 9 different spirals, creating an 18-year motion of the moon. And I just cannot fathom how they were able to get so precise at that point in time, especially if, being the enemy people, they were constantly being attacked.
Yeah, because at Choco Canyon, there isn't any evidence of actually people or a big group living there, and they seem to think that they were some sort of elite. Yet the Great House there can hold up to, I think it's something like 2,000 people. So there must have been pilgrimages going in there, but there aren't any waste heaps or middens or whatever you want to call them to say that these people were really ever there. And of course, you've got the Great North Road and the South Road and things like that. So it's all symbolism of some sort. So it's very, very interesting. And I could go on for about hours, but I better let somebody else have a go. Sorry.
No worries, Daz.
Any other questions for Karim?
I will also say I'm always interested in hearing stories that I haven't heard yet. So if you have one you want to share, I'd love to hear it as well.
I'll see what I can sort out for you.
You set me a challenge now, Karim, because, having a different talk every time you do it, it's got to be a challenge to do that every time I go and do a talk at a society.
Oh, my wife just stares at me sometimes, even my classes, even when students choose the same type of resource before the class and it's the same topic and I'm covering it 2 semesters in a row, I will still sit there and change the slides. I'll add in new information. I'll take out some information. And then, I'll still be like at the end going, oh, I should have also done this. And I forgot about this. And I wanted to do. And she's just like, most teachers, they make their set of slides. They're happy with it and they keep going with it. And then every few years they revise it. Mine, I'm revising it sometimes 2 minutes before the presentation. And it's not a healthy thing, but it's a fun thing.
No. Yeah, but a different presentation entirely. That's more of a challenge.
Karim, do
Yes.
you have a list of popular Aboriginal sites from your sort of research that you've done? Because I've been sort of looking at Aboriginal sites and I'm all over the place trying to sort of. It's just for my personal interest, just putting a talk together. But I keep getting. So many sort of tribes having different sort of stories. I'm just wanting to sort of try and sort of narrow it down to a more sort of popular sort of tribe, which is a little bit more spread out amongst the people, with shared sort of interest or shared stories. Is there anything you can sort of signpost me to?
I don't, unfortunately, because the way in which I built most of this material, some of it came from, old textbooks as well as a few of those sites like you're mentioning, but most of it actually came from specific workshops and discussions with elders. And that was one thing that I was trying to be very careful of, is I wanted to get authentic voices as much as possible, because even if I couldn't have the authentic voice giving the information, I wanted to have it at least secondhand, not more than that. And so I wanted to be the one to hear from them. And so there's Wilfred Buck here in the Cree Nation in Manitoba, who shares a lot of the Cree stories. The Ojibwe, there's 3 different workshops that they've had over the last 2 years that I've been able to participate in. There was all those wonderful Twoeyed Seeing seminars that NASA held. And then for the Mi'kmaq, I'm actually in touch with 2 of the Mi'kmaq elders. And so whenever there's something new that I want to talk about, I reach out to them to ask them if this explanation matches what they would say, and then they always correct me. They always say, well, in this you have to keep in mind that when it's told to 5-year-olds, this is how we tell it, but when it's told to 80-year-olds, this is how we tell it. And it has to do with simply their life experience and how much they can understand of what the story means.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I can say is over the last 2 years, many of them have been open to sharing their stories. They're not all recorded though. And that's one thing where it's difficult. So you have to kind of catch them live, because it's the same reason why they don't publish a lot of their stories, is because once you publish it, you can read it at any time. And if you can read it at any time, it's no longer has the connection to nature that it's supposed to have when it's told to you from a village elder to a guest or to a village statesman.
Yeah, my interest stemmed from, I was fortunate enough to go to Uluru in Central Australia, and we ended up doing a walk around the rock, and we were fortunate again in having a really sort of knowledgeable guide who had quite a lot of or quite a big interest in astronomy himself, and he was telling us about the some of the stories that the people from that particular area sort of associated with the rock, with Uluru itself, and that's what sort of got me going. I just thought this is fantastic and fascinating stuff. I'd like to find out more, so that's what I've done. But I've just spent sort of hours on the internet just sort of trawling sites, and I just keep going from site to site. So I might have to sort of take it from a different angle now.
So I will say, for the Australian Aboriginals, the Australian government has been working on pulling together these stories and centralizing them to share from Aboriginal group to Aboriginal group. And that's something that most of the tribes have actually said yes to. And they've placed their stories in a trust with the government. And those are available off of the government website. If you go to the Australian government website and you look for Aboriginal stories of nature or Aboriginal stories, period, I believe that's how you get to it. But if I can find it, I'll send it to Dave and he'll pass it on to you.
You're a star, and thank you for an absolutely riveting talk. It was a belter. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
All the links I'll put on the VAC website, and if Karim sends me something, I'll pop it on there as well. So,
Cheers, Dave.
Not a problem. Okay, any other questions? No? Okay, well, Karim, absolutely fascinating. I know I saw your talk last year, I think it was.
Solar Sphere, yep.
That was it, yeah. And yeah, so absolutely fascinating. Getting again, totally different last year from what it was tonight. So yeah, amazing to see how differently people view the sky. So, you know, so when you're out there, don't think that what you see is what other people see.
But it's the same stars. We're all sharing the same stars and the same view.
Slightly differently, and you know, we do see things differently, but some people don't see what we sometimes see. And I remember this from many years ago when I was cycling into work one morning, and as we came out of the village where there were no street lights, I was cycling with somebody I worked with. And as we went into the darkness, I looked up and went, "Oh, look at that. Isn't that amazing?" And my friend, he went, "Oh, yeah, carried on. We don't always see what, things the same.
I will say one of my favorite activities for outreach when I have little kids out there, and they're, sometimes some of the little kids, they won't be as enthralled by what's happening, big telescopes and this and that. They're happy to be outside, but they're trying to figure out what they're seeing. And so every now and then I'll be like, look up at the stars. What do you see? And, one of them will be like, oh, I see a cat because I have a cat at home, or, I'll see that. And then every now and then they'll come back to you a little while later and go, look, my cat is approaching a mouse. And they'll start to build the story from star group to star group, from asterism to asterism. And then you tell them, all right, well, now tell me a story using the stars coming from this side of the sky to this side of the sky. And then I'll tell you what the Greeks said from this side of the sky to this side of the sky. And so we share, and they're like, I've heard of that myth. I've heard of that. So is that Orion? Is that what it means? I don't see where the bow and arrow is. Where's the bow and arrow? And so you show them the bow, and then you tell them that the arrow's on the back. You just have to imagine it. So they close their eyes and they're like, okay, I see it. It's just wonderful to see the way in which they'll start to piece together their own story of the stars.
Yeah.
There's a guy in England who's been looking at alternative constellations and making it a little bit more topical, and he's been putting sort of films such as Harry Potter, and he's been making constellations with figures from Harry Potter out of the stars, which I found quite interesting.
Oh, that's wonderful. And honestly, if you enjoy any of the Aboriginal or First Nations ones, or the other cultures like the Arabs or the Chinese or the Hindu culture, what you can do is Stellarium, if you download it on your computer, you can choose to look at alternative constellations instead of the traditional ones. And it'll pull up the alternative constellations, and you can see which star groupings they're talking about when they're talking about the different stories.
Good idea, that. I've not thought about that.
Yeah, because even on the if you use the mobile app, the Stellarium mobile app, you can actually read the stories behind each culture and things like that. And of course, there is something else, and I'm probably going to get thrown off of this now, but unfortunately, with the stars as well, a lot of it, as you say, the ancient stuff included astrology. Oh, don't even know, I don't. But yeah, it included astrology and things like when we're talking about the Chinese. I think it was the Chinese anyway. When Jupiter went into retrograde, an emperor actually turned his armies around and marched back home because he thought it was a bad sign that he shouldn't be going into battle at this time, because Mars had moved, changed its direction. So
Mars was the god of war. I mean, it makes sense, right?
Exactly. So unfortunately, and a lot of decisions were made on astrology, and like you said about the two chaps who didn't get the eclipse right, Ho and Hai, or whatever they were called. Yep. It was the same. A lot of decisions were made on what the stars were doing and how they interpreted what was going on.
I will say I decided to try something this year with my students, because a couple of them at the start of the year I give them a little survey to ask them about their interest in space and what they know about astronomy and things like that. And one of them was like, I just want to learn enough to shut my mom up about astrology. And that was their whole purpose for taking the course. So I sat there and I said, you know what? If that's their purpose, I need to serve that purpose. So I took my Stellarium activity and I added in on January 1st of this year, turn the atmosphere off. Which constellation is the sun sitting in, and does this match your expectation? Because it's in the wrong astrological constellation because everything's shifted by now, right? So they're sitting there going, oh, this is fantastic. I can show my mom that her birth constellation is wrong and she's got the wrong horoscope. And so all these times she's told me that her horoscope is perfect, she was reading the wrong one. This is great.
That's a say, Karim.
It'll be even worse.
So, Dave.
Sorry, Dave?
When it's in the fucus, it'll be even worse.
Yes. Well, that's the other thing, is I tell them that there's 13 zodiac constellations. And they're like, sir, you're wrong. I'm like, oh.
Yeah, I was just going to say, using stellarium is a lot cheaper than having to travel to a total eclipse of the sun to show that it's in the wrong constellation. But I think I prefer traveling for that eclipse. One of you mentioned Harry Potter. And using that for constellations, which is a great modern twist on the modern day mythology, isn't it, really? Dave, I know you've taught scout groups and guides and so on, the star badge, the actual stargazing badge. And part of that course is mythology as well. And that was the bit that I used to struggle with, because I could teach them constellations, how to find the bearings, north, south, east, and west, where's Polaris and latitude and longitude. We could do that type of thing. But getting them on board with constellations and myths, it was difficult. And then I just thought, well, okay, how many like Harry Potter? And these hands went up, little Harry Potter fans. And I said, name some of the characters. They went Bellatrix, Sirius. These are Sirius Black and so on. So there's quite a few names in Harry Potter. And then, of course, there's Percy Jackson as well. Back then, the books that were out was Harry Potter and then Percy Jackson and the Adventures. Percy Jackson is the son of Perseus, I can't remember. Poseidon, son of Poseidon. And then, so all the mythologies there, Gemini and the twins and so on. So when you start bringing Percy Jackson in, the hands start going up and all of a sudden they're interested in mythology. And they're on board then. So then you can take them on the tour of the night sky with Andromeda and Perseus and Cepheus and Cassiopeia and the little stories behind all that. And it's a love story, or it's a bit of a twist on variations, isn't it, really? But you get them on board, and that's modern day mythology. And I'm sure back in ancient times, they sat there around the fire and looked at the stars and told stories in the same manner, but of that day. But a fascinating subject, and as we've said, every time Karim tells us this, I think I've heard this talk about 3 or 4 times now, and each time it's different. Do I have to go to 12, one a month for the full year to get the full 12 variations?
I should put together 12 variations, one for each month, but this is what's funny, is because I gave the Doncaster one just a couple of weeks ago, and I changed it before I went to Hamilton to add in more from Canadian perspective and less from overseas. And then this time around, I changed it again to add in a few more recent ones that I've been reading up on since. Part of it is also, it's just what's on your mind at the time. And that's one of the things about these types of outreach talks, is the more you enjoy what you're presenting, the more the audience will enjoy what you're presenting. And so I remember, I believe it was in November, I was asked to give a talk to a school group, and I gave the talk, and I didn't include the Roman versus the Greek legends of Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. I talked about Ursa Major and Ursa Minor briefly. I said kind of who they are, and then I moved straight into the Wain, the Plough, the Mourners, and then kept going after that. And when I finished, the teacher was like, didn't you at some point talk about the difference between the Romans and the Greek and what it means to their culture? Can you tell that? Because I want to tell the girls that later. So I want you to tell that part. So I pulled the slides back up and I told the stories. And she's like, yeah, that's your best part. Why would you leave that out? I didn't think it was right for the audience. And she's like, no, I want them to know that in some cultures, the girls are not respected. And in some cultures, they can clearly change a girl they don't like into a bear.
Get that a lot in schools. I teach a lot in schools, and the last thing I do before I start the presentation is ask the teacher whose class it is there anything specific they want me to include in it? Because you get caught out so many times they say, oh, we just want to generic this, or we just want that, and then at the end of it they'll say, well, why didn't you say this? And so in the end, I just got around to saying, right, is there anything you want me to specifically focus on? So it might be a nice little tweak to your chat with the teacher before you start in future.
I absolutely agree. I was surprised because they hadn't come to any of my talks, but I guess whoever had heard one before and talked to them about it had mentioned it, and so it was in the back of their mind. But part of the fun also is for the students to see that when somebody's asked something, that they have an answer that's not in the slides. It's not something that they prepared, but it's something that they can still talk about. And that's especially for some of the older elementary school or younger high school kids to see that you don't just prepare the bit that you're going to say. You have more ready.
Without a doubt.
Good stuff. Excellent. So, any other questions for Karim before we depart? No? Well, Karim, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. Brilliant. So, before we go, anybody else want to raise anything or highlight something that might be going on?
Yeah, I'd just like to petition you, Dave, to keep these going.
Yeah. Have we got to get another pandemic going just to get you to do these lovely events for us?
Don't go to those lengths, though. You know, don't go to those lengths.
Well, you've been a lifesaver, Dave. They've been brilliant. All the very different people we've had coming on. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to sort of have been part of it. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for being a part of it, because if
Thank
I was sat here all on my own, it wouldn't have been the same.
Yeah. I mean,
Well,
you
hopefully
talk
we'll
about
do the pop-ups
pandemic.
and-
Yeah, sorry, Dave. You carry on.
I was just going to say, hopefully you'll do the occasional pop-up if we've got an event going on. Because come September, we've got Saturn and Jupiter coming up in the night sky, and Mars not long afterwards, and so on. It'd be great to see those live broadcasts that you've done.
Yeah, so my current thinking is perhaps I'll just do it more, be a ad hoc thing. So those of you who have subscribed to the email, you probably saw when I sent the one out yesterday, I'll leave that active so that if I do think, oh, it's going to be clear tomorrow night, I'll get the telescope out and live broadcast the moon or the sun or whatever, then I'll just pop an email and say, look out, because if the weather's good, I'll send some live stuff out. So, yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, as I was going to say, I think you'll be back sooner. Oh, sorry.
Or if there's a launch or something that's at a good time, then we can get together for something like that, because they're fun to do as well. Sorry, Daz, you were saying?
No, I was just going to say, I think you'll be back sooner than you reckon, because we've got monkeypox, isn't it now? That's the next one. So, we'll all be swinging from the trees.
I do like
Is
bananas.
your glass half full, Dave, Daz, or half empty?
Always half.
It's always empty, trust me. I don't leave no down there.
Yeah, it doesn't last long.
It evaporates.
Excellent. Well, Karim, thanks again for a fascinating talk to finish
thank you.
the Virtual Astronomy Club with. Thanks, everybody, for coming in, and it's been great. It's been a blast.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Dave.
Yes, Dave. Great job.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave.
I've got to say, keep safe, keep well, and keep looking up, folks. Take care.
Cheers,
Bye.
Dave.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Hello.
See you all around.
See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.